The world was not always as it is now. There was a time when humanity thrived, when cities pulsed with life and the future looked bright. But that was before the outbreak. It started as whispers of an infection, a virus that spread from the farthest corners of the world to the busiest cities, decimating populations in days. By the time governments reacted, it was too late. The virus did not just kill, it resurrected. The dead walked again, twisted, rotting creatures with insatiable hunger for human flesh. They were not the slow, lumbering zombies of old stories, but faster, more relentless, driven by a primal need to consume. They swarmed in waves, unstoppable in their hunger, a plague unlike anything the world had ever seen. In the heart of the devastated city of Arkvale, the last remaining survivors huddled in a fortified compound. The walls, made of reinforced steel and concrete, were a feeble attempt at holding back the inevitable. Inside, the survivors were a mix of soldiers, scientists, and ordinary citizens, each clinging to a faint hope that somewhere out there, a cure or a solution might still exist. Among them was Captain Sarah Rhodes, a battle-hardened leader who had seen too much death. Her once bright eyes were now tired and cold, haunted by the memories of friends and family lost to the Horde. She stood at the command center, overseeing the tactical plans as they prepared for another assault. The Horde had been growing in number, their relentless attacks pushing the survivors to their limits. "We've got a full-scale attack coming," Sarah said, her voice low but firm. "We've lost contact with the northern defense line, and reports say they're pushing through the barricades faster than we can rebuild them." Her second-in-command, Lieutenant Mark Davis, looked up from the map sprawled across the table. His face was grim, the weight of their situation evident in the deep lines etched into his features. "How much longer do you think we can hold out?" Sarah's gaze hardened. "We don't have the luxury of time anymore. We'll hold as long as we can. But it's getting worse." The compound had been fortified for months, with armed guards patrolling every entrance, watching for any signs of the undead. But even the strongest fortifications had weaknesses, and the zombies had adapted. They learned to swarm, to find the cracks in the defenses, and they were growing bolder. As night fell, the sound of distant growls echoed through the compound, a constant reminder of the impending doom. Inside the walls, the survivors prepared themselves for battle. Weapons were checked, ammunition counted, and everyone was assigned a post. The quiet hum of the generators and the clinking of metal filled the air as the tension built to a fever pitch. Sarah stood on the rooftop, gazing out at the horizon. The city, once bustling with life, now lay in ruins. Fires burned in the distance, casting an eerie glow over the shattered skyline. The streets were empty, save for the occasional wandering undead. The world, it seemed, had come to an end. "We need a miracle," she whispered to herself, her breath fogging in the cold air. But miracles were in short supply these days. As the night wore on, the first signs of the assault appeared, small groups of zombies, shambling forward, seemingly harmless. But Sarah knew better. These were just the beginning. The main horde would follow, and once they arrived, all bets were off. Back inside the compound, the survivors waited in silence, preparing for the worst. They knew the horde was coming, and they knew that this might be their last stand. As the first screams rang out from the perimeter, Sarah tightened her grip on her rifle. It was time to fight. The shrill sounds of alarm bells rang through the compound, signaling the beginning of the end. It wasn't just the distant growls of the approaching zombies anymore, there was something different in the air, a palpable tension that made the hairs on the back of every survivor's neck stand on end. The zombies were here. Captain Sarah Rhodes rushed down from the rooftop, her boots pounding against the concrete as she made her way to the front lines. She joined Lieutenant Mark Davis, who was already barking orders into his radio. The commotion outside grew louder by the second, as the survivors prepared for the fight of their lives. "All units to positions," Mark shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Do not let them breach the barricades. Use every weapon at your disposal." The survivors were a mix of seasoned fighters and civilians who had learned to defend themselves through sheer necessity. The compound's outer perimeter was lined with sniper towers and concrete barricades, but even the best defenses could only hold for so long. The first wave of zombies had already begun to hammer against the barricades with terrifying force. Sarah scanned the perimeter. Through the fog of war, she could see the hulking figures of the undead coming into view, their unnatural speed making them more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. They moved in clusters, a shifting mass of decaying bodies, eyes glowing with hunger. There was no rhyme or reason to their movements, no strategy. They simply advanced, unstoppable, determined to breach the walls at any cost. On the eastern side, the first barricade was already under siege. A group of survivors fired from the towers, their shots ringing out in the night as they picked off the first wave of zombies, but it was clear they weren't making much of a dent. The zombies just kept coming. Their numbers were staggering, thousands, maybe more. "We need more firepower," one of the gunners shouted from the barricade. His voice trembled, but he didn't stop shooting. "They're not slowing down. Hold them off," Sarah yelled back. She could feel the weight of their hope resting on her shoulders. If the barricades fell, the compound would become a death trap. Every person inside knew it was a matter of life or death. She turned to Mark. "Prepare for the second wave. We'll need to fall back to the inner defenses if the outer ones go down." Mark nodded grimly. "Understood. But if it gets worse, we won't be able to hold them forever." As if on cue, the ground trembled beneath their feet. The first barricade collapsed under the pressure of the zombies' relentless assault. The sounds of splintering wood and snapping metal echoed in the air. A flood of undead surged through the opening, moving faster than any of the survivors had expected. The front lines erupted into chaos as the survivors fired into the horde, but there was no stopping the tide. The zombies were too numerous, too relentless. As the survivors pushed back, more came, each one as terrifying and hungry as the last. Sarah felt a surge of panic deep within her chest, but she forced it down. She had been trained for moments like this. She grabbed a nearby rifle from one of the soldiers and took aim, firing shot after shot with cold precision. The rounds tore through the undead, but it was like fighting against a tidal wave. "We need a new plan," she shouted over the din of gunfire. "They'll keep coming, no matter what we do. We have to hit them where it hurts." Mark joined her, his face pale but resolute. "We might not have that luxury, Sarah. If we don't take them down now, they'll breach the inner compound." As the second wave came crashing through, Sarah's mind raced. There was no time left for hesitation. The last stand had begun. The first breach was only the beginning. The floodgates had opened, and the zombies poured into the compound like an unstoppable force, relentless in their pursuit. Their growls echoed across the battlefield, creating a cacophony that threatened to drown out every other sound. Gunfire, shouts, and the frantic screams of the survivors filled the air as the undead flooded the inner defenses, overwhelming the outer barricades in a matter of minutes. Sarah stood at the center of it all, her heart pounding, her grip tight on her rifle. The adrenaline was almost too much to handle, but she had learned long ago how to keep control in moments like this. She could feel the weight of the compound's survival resting on her shoulders. "Fall back. Fall back to the second line," she shouted, her voice steady but urgent. The soldiers obeyed without hesitation, pulling back as the zombies surged forward. Sarah and Mark led the retreat toward the inner defenses, another layer of walls, reinforced with every weapon they had left. The survivors moved in a tight formation, covering each other as they fell back toward the heart of the compound. They could hear the screams from behind, the sound of desperate fighting, as the undead swarmed over those who were too slow to retreat. For a moment, Sarah's heart skipped a beat as she realized just how few people were left standing. "How many do we have left?" she asked, turning to Mark as they made their way down a narrow hallway to the inner command room. "Not many," he replied, his face grim. "Less than 50, including civilians. And most of them can barely handle a weapon." Sarah gritted her teeth. "We're not going to make it if we don't do something drastic. We need a way to stop them. To slow them down." As they entered the command room, Sarah was met with the sight of the remaining survivors, soldiers, civilians, and a few scientists, huddled around a table, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear. Their weapons were ready, but it was clear that morale was crumbling. "Listen up," Sarah said, stepping to the front of the room. "We've got one last chance to stop them. The northern gates are still holding, but only just. We're going to need to set up explosives along the outer perimeter. It won't stop them for long, but it might slow them down long enough for us to make a stand." "We don't have enough explosives for that," one of the soldiers, Corporal Jameson, protested. "Even if we did, it's not going to make a difference. We're outnumbered, outgunned." Sarah's jaw clenched. She knew it was a desperate plan, but it was the only one they had left. "Then we'll fight them at the gates. We'll hold the line and make them pay for every inch they take." There was silence in the room, broken only by the distant sounds of the zombie horde smashing against the outer defenses. It was a terrifying sound, one that signaled the inevitable. But Sarah's voice cut through the tension. "We're not just surviving anymore," she said, her eyes hardening with resolve. "We're fighting for every person who's been lost. Every city that's been overrun. We're fighting to make sure the world isn't completely gone." Mark stood beside her, his face resolute. "We make our stand here. This is it. We fight, or we die." One by one, the survivors nodded, their fear replaced by a grim determination. They had come too far to give up now. As they prepared for their final stand, Sarah looked out the window. The horde was closer now, shambling toward the compound in waves. She could see the flicker of firelight in the distance, their only hope of stopping the zombies in their tracks. She took a deep breath and gripped her rifle. "Get ready," she said quietly. "The real fight is about to begin." And then, without another word, they moved out into the night, prepared to face the horde in a battle that would determine the fate of humanity. The compound was now a battlefield, its walls filled with desperate soldiers and civilians, all clinging to the hope that they could survive the onslaught. But there was no mistaking it, the last stand had begun. Outside, the relentless roar of the undead grew louder, their insatiable hunger driving them forward in a seemingly unending wave. Captain Sarah Rhodes led the charge to the northern gate, where the survivors had set up their final line of defense. The ground was littered with weapons, barricades, and makeshift explosives. The hum of energy from the makeshift barricades and generators filled the air, a harsh reminder of how fragile their existence had become. They had a plan, but time was running out. The horde was too close now. "We hold this line," Sarah said, her voice firm as she addressed the survivors around her. "No one leaves. We fight for as long as we can. For everyone we've lost." The survivors nodded, their faces a mix of fear and determination. They knew what was coming. The first wave of zombies had already reached the outer barricades, and Sarah could see the chaos unfolding before her eyes. The horde moved with precision, swarming like locusts, breaking through walls with terrifying speed. "Start the countdown," Sarah ordered. A soldier at the far end of the gate activated a remote detonator, and the first explosive charges, set along the perimeter, detonated in a series of earth-shattering blasts. The explosion sent shockwaves through the compound, knocking a few of the survivors off their feet. The zombies closest to the explosion were torn apart, their bodies disintegrating into gore, but the rest of the horde simply stumbled over the wreckage and kept coming. The survivors held their breath for a split second. For that fleeting moment, it seemed as though they might have slowed the horde, but the truth was clear, the explosion only bought them a few moments. More and more undead filled the gaps, pushing forward with an unrelenting pace. "Get ready!" Mark Davis shouted as he crouched behind the barricades, his rifle aimed at the advancing zombies. The survivors opened fire, their weapons roaring in unison, each shot echoing through the compound. The zombies fell, their twisted bodies collapsing to the ground, but their numbers were overwhelming. No matter how many fell, another wave replaced them. "Fall back to secondary defenses," Sarah yelled as the first wave of zombies broke through the perimeter. The survivors scrambled to regroup, moving quickly to the inner walls. The explosions had given them a momentary advantage, but it was fleeting. The Horde was already spilling into the compound, and the survivors needed to adapt, fast. They moved in a coordinated fashion, retreating into the center of the compound where the last of their defenses stood. Behind them, the sounds of the chaos grew louder: screams, gunfire, the sickening sound of flesh being torn. Every survivor knew that if they didn't hold this position, it was over. "We need to get to the high ground," Mark yelled. "Get to the watchtower and set up snipers." The group moved quickly, using what little cover they had left. Sarah climbed the stairs to the high tower, her rifle in hand, as she scanned the battlefield below. The scene was apocalyptic. Bodies littered the ground, both human and undead, as the fight for survival raged on. The survivors had only a small window before the zombies overran their position. The tower provided a clear view of the entire compound, but the dead were closing in from all directions. Sarah took a deep breath. This was it. The final stand. "Mark," she shouted over the radio. "If we don't take them down now, they'll overwhelm us." "I know," came Mark's voice, tight with urgency. "We've got one shot at this. We have to pull back to the final fallback point if we're going to make it." Sarah glanced at the watchtower's remaining ammunition stock. It wouldn't be enough for long. The zombies were getting closer, pushing forward with terrifying speed. She could see the desperation in the eyes of the survivors below. They were all exhausted, their stamina running low, but they still fought on, unwilling to give up. "We're not going down without a fight," Sarah muttered to herself as she steadied her aim. "Hold the line." With the first few shots, the snipers began to thin the herd, dropping zombies one by one, but for every one that fell, 2 more took its place. It was clear, there would be no easy victory. They had fought so hard, for so long, but the Horde was too vast, too numerous, and the odds were increasingly impossible. In the distance, Sarah saw the faint glow of fires rising, casting long shadows across the compound. The final stand had come. The hours dragged on, each minute stretching longer than the last as the survivors held their ground. The Horde, relentless and countless, showed no sign of slowing. Every shot fired seemed to only thin their numbers momentarily, before the overwhelming wave of undead pushed forward once more. The compound, once a bastion of hope, was now a battlefield where survival seemed increasingly impossible. Sarah stood at the forefront of the final line of defense, her rifle empty, but her resolve unshaken. She could hear the soldiers beside her, their breathing ragged, their ammunition dwindling. Behind them, the wounded were huddled in the makeshift shelter, awaiting their fate. There was no time for retreat anymore. The compound was surrounded, and the last of the barricades were beginning to fall. "We don't have much time left," Mark said, his voice tight as he reloaded his rifle. His eyes flicked to the soldiers around them, many of whom were now struggling just to keep fighting. "What's the plan, Sarah?" Sarah's eyes scanned the Horde outside. Their numbers were endless. The streets were filled with zombies, crawling, shuffling, running, each one hungry for human flesh. It wasn't just a fight to survive anymore, it was a fight for dignity, for the memory of everything they had lost. "We make one final stand," Sarah said, her voice firm despite the hopelessness creeping into her thoughts. "We're going to take down as many as we can before they break through. We fight them at the gates and give the others a chance to escape." Mark shook his head. "There's no way out for us anymore. They'll overrun the gates." "I know," Sarah replied quietly. "But we don't let them win without a fight." With a final glance at their remaining forces, Sarah ordered the survivors to prepare for one last charge. They had only one option left: to create a diversion that might give the civilians a chance to escape through the underground tunnels. It was a desperate plan, but it was the only one left. If they didn't try, they would all die here, in the ruins of what used to be civilization. "Form up," Sarah called, rallying the soldiers into position. "We're going out with everything we've got." The survivors gathered their remaining weapons, some wielding only knives or makeshift spears, but all determined. As the last remaining explosives were placed along the gates, Sarah set her eyes on the undead mass just outside. It seemed as though the entire world had fallen to them, but not today. Not yet. With a single order, they charged. The survivors rushed forward, gunfire and cries of defiance filling the air. Their footsteps echoed loudly in the chaos, but there was no hesitation. There was no retreat. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps as she led the charge, firing her rifle into the oncoming horde, each shot taking down one of the undead, but for every one that fell, another took its place. She pushed forward, her mind focused solely on the task ahead. The gates had to hold. The civilians had to escape. But then, the explosion came. The massive charge of explosives detonated with a deafening roar, sending a wave of fire and debris across the compound. The shockwave threw Sarah off her feet, and for a moment, everything went black. When Sarah opened her eyes, the world had shifted. The dust and smoke from the explosion hung in the air like a thick fog, and the sound of zombies tearing through the compound had been drowned out by the force of the blast. But it didn't matter. The diversion had worked. The civilians were making their way to the underground tunnels. Mark was beside her, helping her to her feet. His face was smeared with blood and dirt, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her believe that they might actually have a chance. "Go!" Sarah shouted. "Get to the tunnels." He hesitated, but only for a moment. Then, he nodded. "You're coming, right?" "I'll hold them off," Sarah replied. "You lead them out. Get them to safety." Mark didn't argue. He turned and began ushering the civilians toward the tunnels, but Sarah knew there was no time to waste. The horde was closing in, and their chances were slim. She gripped her rifle tightly as the zombies surged forward, their numbers seeming endless. With one final glance toward the tunnel entrance, Sarah turned to face the oncoming tide of the undead. This was the endgame. The last stand. But she was ready. "Let's finish this," she whispered, taking aim. And with that, she fired into the horde, knowing that every bullet would count, and that this fight would determine the future of humanity. The last line of defense had been broken. The gates had fallen, the barricades crumbled under the unrelenting force of the zombie horde. The compound, once a sanctuary, was now a slaughterhouse. The survivors, those who hadn't made it to the tunnels, had been overwhelmed. But there was still one last flicker of hope. The civilians were making their way underground, where perhaps they could survive. Perhaps they could rebuild. Captain Sarah Rhodes stood at the front, her rifle nearly empty, her body battered and bruised, but she didn't retreat. She couldn't. She was the last of the fighters, the last of the soldiers who would stand against the undead wave. She gritted her teeth, her eyes bloodshot and strained, as she fired into the horde. Her bullets were no longer as accurate as before, but she was determined to take as many of them down as she could. Mark Davis had led the civilians to safety, but he had stayed behind just long enough to give Sarah a final chance to make her stand. He had known the odds, but he hadn't hesitated. There was no more room for hesitation. The world outside was apocalyptic. The fires of the compound still smoldered in the distance, casting a ghostly light over the blood-soaked ground. The sound of the undead grew louder, closer. It was a deafening roar, a monstrous symphony that reminded her of everything they had lost. But she wasn't done yet. With the last of her ammunition, Sarah fired, each shot a final act of defiance. She knew her time was limited, that the horde would overtake her soon enough, but she wouldn't go quietly. She had given everything to this fight. Now, she would give the final, desperate effort to hold them back. A monstrous figure loomed ahead, larger than the others, its grotesque body towering over the undead mass. It was a mutated creature, far more dangerous than any of the others. Its skin was mottled with decaying flesh, and its eyes glowed an eerie yellow, fixed on Sarah as it lumbered forward. The ground trembled with each of its steps. She didn't hesitate. She fired once, twice, but the creature didn't stop. It charged, its roar deafening, its arms outstretched, ready to rip her apart. But in that moment, just as it closed in on her, a loud blast echoed across the field. The explosion was massive, blinding light and a violent shockwave tore through the horde, scattering zombies in every direction. Sarah was thrown back to the ground, her body crashing against the earth with a sickening thud. She could barely make sense of what had happened. Had the tunnel explosion triggered a chain reaction? She tried to stand, but her body refused to cooperate. Her vision blurred, and the pain in her chest was unbearable. For a moment, she thought the end had come. But then, through the smoke and the dust, she saw him. Mark Davis. He was standing at the edge of the battlefield, covered in soot and blood, his rifle raised as he picked off the remaining zombies with deadly accuracy. He had come back. "I told you I wasn't leaving without you," he said, his voice strained but resolute. Sarah tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her limbs felt like lead, and she could hardly focus on anything beyond the pounding in her head. But she knew, somehow, that it wasn't over. They had made it to the final moments, the final stand, but they weren't alone. The civilians, the last of humanity, had escaped. "Let's go," Mark said, crouching beside her. "It's not over yet." With his help, Sarah struggled to her feet. The two of them stumbled toward the last remaining exit, the underground tunnel leading to an uncertain future. They weren't sure what awaited them below ground, but for the first time in what felt like forever, there was a glimmer of hope. The sounds of the horde were still there, but in the distance now. The battle for Arkvale was over, but the war for humanity's survival had only just begun. There was no guarantee of safety, no promise of victory, but Sarah knew this: they had fought. They had made a stand, and in doing so, they had ensured that the last remnants of humanity had a chance to survive. As she descended into the depths of the tunnel, the final rays of dawn crept over the horizon. The first light of a new day, however uncertain, had arrived. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, there would be a tomorrow.